Hello, my name is Vince Davis, and I am the Annual Cropping Systems Weed Scientist at the University of Wisconsin in the Department of Agronomy. Today I want to talk about some principles of weed management, and I'm going to break it down into about 4 segments to help you study for the CCA exam and bring you up to speed with some of the principles of weed science that will hopefully help you out past that exam, as well as help you out with your everyday practicing career. The first section I'm going to start with is weed identification, and parts of this section is the fundamentals, and that's where we want to start with this, and we'll get through that. And I'm not going to be able to go in detail on descriptions of how to identify all of the weeds you are going to encounter. That would be a full 16-week class within itself, so I'm only going to go fairly quickly but leave you with some images that you can study and rewind and pick your own parts that you can study and help you out with some of the key weeds that you'll run across and maybe have already ran across in your career. So we'll get into this and talk about some of the principles. First off, what is a weed? That may seem like a ridiculous question to some people that have been dealing with weeds, but to actually define the weed is maybe more difficult than you might think, because there's different ways we can think about it. I think probably the most generally accepted definition is that simply a plant growing when and where it is not wanted. There's certainly implications to that definition, as in if there were no humans or no human interest like we have, then there would be no weeds. So that's one implication to that. But simply plants that interfere with the growth of desirable plants and desirable vegetation, and also usually plants that are persistent and can take over an environment, are plants that we don't like, or plants that we call weeds often, and usually it's because they damage cropping systems or natural systems or just interfere with human activities, and therefore those types of plants are undesirable at that time and at that place. So that's what we're talking about, are weeds in a location where we don't want them, or at a time we don't want them. There's certainly some different biological traits of these plants that we call weeds. Oftentimes they're very persistent, and they can be persistent through vegetative propagation. They can be persistent through mechanisms of seed dormancy, and they can also be very persistent because of high reproduction rates. So they can take over an area because they can produce a lot of offspring. They often spread rapidly, and they have several dispersal mechanisms, maybe through wind, water, animals, humans carrying them around activities. Seeds move through machinery and combines very easily. So oftentimes weeds spread rapidly. Oftentimes weeds can be very competitive, whether it's in a natural environment or in a crop environment. So those are traits that we certainly don't like. We're going to talk about crop weed competition today, so we're going to talk about why it is they're competitive and for what types of resources. And often weeds are highly adaptable. They're plants that just adapt to their environments very well. We call this high plasticity, and that adaptation comes from multiple reasons. It can be because it has high genetic diversity, or just has developmental plasticity, meaning they can survive periods of drought or periods of low fertility or areas of compaction better than sometimes the crop plants that we desire, and so they thrive in less desirable situations sometimes because of this plasticity. There are several different ways we can classify weeds. We can classify weeds by their life histories. We can classify weeds by their modes of reproduction, their photoperiod sensitivity, their ecological habits. We have legal definitions of weeds, like the noxious weed law. So we can define weeds by what are on the noxious weed laws. There's certainly ways we define weeds through botanical mechanisms, and that's really the scientific way of deciding which weeds are similar to each other through families and Latin binomials. And then we can also classify weeds by their life cycle, for instance. And we're going to talk about some of these different things. Let's start off with life cycles. We can certainly talk about annuals. And annuals are plants that complete their entire life cycle in 1 year. So they go from being a seed to producing seed or producing more seeds in one annual year. On the flip side, there are biennials, and biennials are plants that take 2 years to complete their full life cycle. So generally in the first year, they only have vegetative growth, and their whole purpose of growing that first year is to get large, produce a large root generally that gives them storage and fuel to survive that first winter. And then in that next year, they convert all of that energy into reproducing and leaving seeds for offspring at the end of that second year. So they're plants that are programmed to survive 2 years, and then any plants programmed to survive more than 2 years we call perennials. So it can be 2+ years, it may be 3 years, it may be 20 years. It kind of depends on the weed, but perennials live longer than 2 years. Why would you care about life cycles? Well, if these are weeds that you want to control for whatever reason because they're interfering with your crop production or your recreational activity, you want to know the life cycle of those weeds because it can have a high impact on how it is you want to manage those weeds. If you're trying to manage annuals, you're always looking to limit the seed production and also limit the seed persistence so you can manage that weed over the long term. And so you're going to be focused on doing that and focused on probably the vegetative early growth areas of that weed to control that weed where it's a lot more sensitive to management recommendations or management tactics. On the flip side, perennials can be a lot easier to control, or you can be more successful in controlling biennials and perennials if you target the root system a little bit better. And to target the root system, it may require you to target control of those weeds at different times of the year, as well as in different mechanisms that actually, if you're using herbicides, for instance, you would want to use a translocated herbicide that's going to get that herbicide down to the root. So it needs to be translocated to the root to kill that root tissue, and that's usually going to happen easier if you're targeting the timing of control when after flowering in the late summer and early fall, when that plant is programmed to try to store more of its reserves to survive winter in the roots. So a lot more of the source to sink ratio from the sugars that are being produced are translocated to the roots. And so that's going to highly impact when you're going to target control of these things. So simply understanding life cycles is important for long-term management of weeds. Now, speaking of perennials, there's several different ways perennials can actually survive or have mechanisms to survive. It can be through stolons, which are above ground stems that root at the nodes. It can be underground root structures called rhizomes or tubers, which are actually compound storage structures at the end of a rhizome, or underground storage structures at the end of a rhizome. It can be bulbs, kind of like a garlic or onion is a bulb, or you can have a corm, which is an underground stem, but it's an enlarged stem that's also a storage mechanism for energy reserves. Again, why do we care? Because the life cycle really determines when you're going to target a control. I've already kind of covered this a little bit. I was ahead of myself, but for instance, we haven't talked about herbicides yet, but when we talk about herbicides, there are herbicides that are contact herbicides and translocated herbicides. And again, as I already said, if you're targeting a perennial weed like Canada thistle, a contact herbicide is not going to be effective by just targeting the above ground vegetation, because since there's a lot of energy reserved in those roots, it will just regrow quickly. Whereas if you use a translocated herbicide at the right time of year, it'll translocate down to that root material and have a much more successful control. Another thing is even if you're using tillage, I've talked about herbicides, but if you're talking about tillage and different cropping systems, crops are going to compete with the weeds differently at different times of the year. So different cropping systems and different tillage systems may favor more annual weeds or more perennial weeds as you go through time. So one of the things in weed management we talk about a lot is diversity, and we talk about diversity in terms of utilizing different crop rotations, also diversity as in changing up your tillage systems. In a system where you constantly till, you're going to drive the weed community to favor more annual weeds, because the perennial weeds are going to be continually disturbed or destroyed in the rooting structure, and they're not going to be able to survive long term anyway. So that system is going to favor weeds that can go from seed to seed very quickly. On the flip side, no-till systems are going to favor biennial and perennial weeds, just because of the opposite is true, where perennial or no-till systems are not going to be able to bury the seeds from annual weeds near as readily. So as seeds are left up on the soil surface, they're much more susceptible to premature emergence, where they wouldn't be able to survive the winter if an annual emerged in the fall at an unfavorable time. So that would actually play into depleting the seed bank. They're also going to be more susceptible to predation or being eaten by animals. So leaving weed seeds up near the surface in a no-till system can help drive down that weed seed bank population and not bury those seeds for long-term storage. So that would slowly help limit the amount of annual weeds in a system. But if you don't have constant soil disturbance, it's going to allow the perennial and biennials to flourish. So rotating different tillage systems is going to be helpful for long-term management of different life cycles. Now, in addition to just knowing or being able to determine whether the weed is an annual weed or a perennial weed, you have to actually be able to identify the weed specifically that you're trying to deal with, so you understand a lot of the other things that relate to its ecological niches. You also have to be able to know, if you're going to use herbicides, how those specific weed species relate to herbicides in terms of their herbicide susceptibility or tolerance. How competitive are these certain weeds going to be with the different crops that you're growing? That crop competitiveness is a really important factor in terms of determining at what level of weeds can you tolerate and still produce the level of crop you want to produce. Also, some weeds can harbor other pests. They can be carriers for other disease, or also carriers for other insects, or attract insects. So you also want to be able to identify the weeds so you can understand the interactions that weeds have with other pests. And also, there are some cases, particularly for weeds in natural systems, where there are natural enemies out there. So are there natural enemies, or is there going to be any natural limit to the amount that particular weed species will spread? You can only know by understanding what weed specifically you are dealing with in a system. So you always must know the pest before you can control the pest. Again, I don't have time to go through how to identify every weed specifically, but I do want to talk about some of the most critical parts of weed identification. We'll start off here in just understanding that there's a very large difference between broadleaf weeds and grass weeds. Here you have a broadleaf weed on the left-hand side of the screen that I'm pointing at, and there's going to be some really important characteristics of these weeds that we're going to look at in terms of the leaf arrangement, stem arrangement, the rooting structure, the shape of the stem, the shape of the leaves. We're going to talk about a lot of these things. The shape of the inflorescence, which describes the flower and the fruit clusters. And all of these things are important and critical for both broadleaves and weeds, and grass weeds. For the grass weeds, though, we're going to spend a lot more time not only talking about inflorescence, but a lot more time talking about the characteristics of the hairs on the leaf blade, the characteristics in the shape of the stem, and the characteristics of the ligule, which is a membrane in between the stem and the leaf sheath. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit more specificity. We're going to start off with the grasses. This is called the Poaceae family. Stems in the grasses are usually hollow, are oftentimes hollow. The area between the internodes are usually pretty long. With grass weeds, there's always just two leaves, usually with parallel or always with parallel venation. When we talk about broadleafs, there's going to be different types of venation in compound leaves, but with grasses, you always have long linear grasses. But the most important thing is they are monocots, which means there is only one cotyledon as it comes out of the ground. So we call grasses monocots. There are several important grasses, many important grasses, grass weeds in cropping systems. This just lists a few over here on the right-hand side. Foxtails are very common, barnyard grass, different fescues, bromes, Johnson grass, shattercane, annual ryegrass. All of these are just a small sample of the problematic grass weeds that are out there. Now, to show pictures of some of these terms that I've just used, again, here is the ligule. The ligule describes the appendage or the membrane that connects the leaf blade, and here I'm pointing out with the mouse the leaf blade going to the left, and then the stem, of course, going up here as I'm going up and down on the right is a stem. So this here is, there's a ligule in here, and then also this is what we call an auricle region, and very few grasses have auricles. We're going to talk about the very few weedy grasses have auricles. We're going to talk about that, and this whole thing is kind of a blow up of this section here you see on this larger grass that you see to the right hand side. Now, I've also already used this term inflorescence, and inflorescence describes the seed head and the arrangement of the seed head. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more specificity. Let's start off with the stems, though. Stems are very important with grasses. There's a few different shapes. You can clearly have a round stem, and basically if you cut a stem with a knife or dissected it in half, that's where you would get the shape here. So you can clearly have a round stem. Here's a couple examples of round stems, such as Johnson grass or shattercane, or here's even giant foxtail. You can see is clearly round. But you can also have flattened stems, and flattened stems often come from what we call folded venation, and I'll describe that a little bit more in a little bit. But you see here that this stem is a lot more oval, and that's if you rolled it between your fingers, you would feel that it doesn't roll like something round would. It flip-flops and is very hard to roll. So whether or not the stem is round or flattened is critical for identification. Again, here's some pictures that show ligules in a collar region. Here is a better picture that show you what auricles are. I talked about auricles in that last thing. Auricles are an extension of the leaf blade that actually wraps around the stem. So very characteristic of some particular grass weeds, like quackgrass, for instance, has auricles and what we call clasping auricles, where the auricles actually connect to each other, and I'll point that out a little bit later. What's important on this slide, though, is to show you the different types of ligule types. Again, ligules are also very, very important. Some grass weeds, like barnyard grass, is actually absent a ligule, so there is no ligule here at all. There's just absent any kind of membrane. Then there are ligules that we call hairy ligules. And if you see in this picture here, you can actually see the hairs. They can be long hairs, or it can be a short fringe of hairs, but there's actually hairs protruding from that membrane that we call the ligule here. Or you can have a ligule that is clear and we call it membranous. It's not hairy at all, but it just appears to be kind of a clear layer of plant tissue, if you will, and the top of that layer may be smooth. It may be a little bit jagged. You kind of see in this picture here it's a little bit jagged. It may not necessarily be smooth across the top, but it's just kind of a thin, membranous or lacking hair plant tissue. The length of that ligule can be important for identification. Some grass weeds have really long ligules, some have really short ligules, even if they are membranous. Large crabgrass, for instance, is a good example of a grass weed with a really long membranous ligule. Here's some examples of ligules. Here's a membranous ligule that you'll see, and you got to look real close. Again, it's kind of a clear tissue, but here's Johnson grass with a very clear membranous ligule, and shattercane with a clear membranous ligule, where here's giant foxtail that has this fringe of hairs on the top of the ligule, and here's yellow foxtail with hairs on the top of the ligule, and a couple other important characteristics you notice here that you would get to is for the foxtails, you'll see yellow foxtail has very long hairs all around on the base of the leaf blade, where giant foxtail does not. So with some of these specific species, there are some very clear differences, or very specific differences between these species to identify, even though other characteristics like the membrane may look identical across the species. To point out some more differences across leaf blades, here you have Johnson grass and shattercane, where you see no hairs present on the leaf blade, where giant foxtail, if you roll the top of that leaf blade or make a bend with the top of that leaf blade and then often hold it up to the light and roll that leaf blade like this, you'll see a very short fringe of hairs, and if you also feel it with your fingers, you'll feel that it feels kind of fuzzy here because of that. Where yellow foxtail, again, is very obvious that you have long hairs near the base of that leaf blade. So again, a specific characteristic. Look at some more characteristics here. On the left is where you have the clasping auricles that I already talked about of quackgrass, where barnyard grass you can see where there's no ligule, which I already talked about as well. And then to throw something in here from a perennial, here is a very characteristic perennial stolon of Bermuda grass. So you can see how the Bermuda grass is branched because of these stolons, and we'll talk about that with some other grass species coming up too. And then clear on the right hand side is something I'm going to throw in new here, but this is the triangular stem section, and actually with sedges it's actually called a corm and not a stem. But on the right hand side is yellow nutsedge. It's a very problematic weed in crop production of Wisconsin, but it's not a grass. It's actually a sedge. So I'm mostly talking about grasses and broadleafs today, but sedges are a category all of their own. So we often say sedges have edges because they have triangular stems. It's actually technically called a triangular corm. You can see the hollow middle here. So it's not a grass, but it is a sedge. But it is still an important weed of Wisconsin. Now, I talked about the importance of the inflorescence earlier, or that we'll talk about inflorescences. Couple different options here for inflorescence. You can see weeds like Johnson grass and shattercane where they have what we call an open panicle. Okay, which just means that you have these miniature stems or seeds that are coming off multiple things, and that panicle is open, where you can see the difference here with the foxtails on the right hand side. We call these compact panicles, so they don't branch at all. And again, there are usually subtle differences between some of these weed species that are easy to pick up, where yellow foxtail and green foxtail oftentimes have a very erect compact panicle, where giant foxtail usually has this very characteristic bend to it, where the panicle is longer and less rigid, so it often falls over. And so this is a very characteristic look that you see here with giant foxtail in relation to the other foxtails. Seeds, seed size, seed shape, and seed characteristics can also be very important to tell the differences between some of these grass weeds. For instance, on the left you have Johnson grass and shattercane. both somewhat similar, larger seeds, but you'll see Johnson grass seeds tend to be a little smaller than shattercane and also usually much shinier. They also tend to be more oval or longer, more football shaped, where shattercane tends to be a much larger seed and usually less shiny. If you look over here at the right, you can get into how you can tell some very specific things apart with seeds. Again, size is important. Yellow foxtail seed tends to be larger than giant foxtail seed, but there's another important characteristic we're going to talk about in a minute with those foxtail seeds. Just to show you a couple more up-close pictures, I already talked about rolling that giant foxtail leaf again on the bend. You can just get a better look here from a pictorial of how you'll see those short fringe of hairs and how they relate with giant foxtail. Again, I talked about the importance of this panicle here as an identifying characteristic. But what I want you to look at up here is the seed and the shape of these V's on here. And we're going to talk about that. This is giant foxtail, and how much of the seed this V consumes is kind of important. Again, some more characteristics different between the foxtails here. Here's yellow foxtail again with these fringe of hairs I talked about. In contrast, on the right-hand side is green foxtail. I haven't talked about green foxtail yet, but some differences between green foxtail and giant foxtail is that green foxtail does not have those short hairs on top of the leaf blade, but different from the other foxtails, it has a fringe of hairs on the edge of the leaf sheath. So if you look down here where I'm moving this mouse, you'll see these hairs that are protruding out the edge of the leaf sheath as it wraps around the stem, where yellow foxtail over here on the left does not have those hairs. So some real different placement in terms of hairs, hair placement to pay attention to distinguish these species apart. And then the last thing I want to talk about, and I've already started to talk about this on that giant foxtail slide a couple slides ago with the seed, is characteristics of seed shape. So when you're looking at foxtail seeds, you can actually tell the difference between foxtail seeds from this area we call the palea here, and how much of the seed the palea covers. So with yellow foxtail, as we see here, the palea actually covers less than half of the seed shape, okay? Where we can compare that again back to green foxtail or even the giant foxtail of a few slides ago, where green foxtail, that palea covers about half the seed shape. The giant foxtail, which I showed a few slides ago, covered more like 75 or 80% of the seed. And this yellow foxtail over here, you can see the palea covers less than half the seed. So we can really use characteristics of these species to identify the seeds apart from one another through very specific characteristics. I'm just going to go through some of these other grass weeds a little bit quicker just because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but large crabgrass is another very important weed in the state of Wisconsin, particularly in lawns. It tends to be a more flat growing grass. It's not real erect. It tends to spread out on the surface a little bit more. You can see the seed shape up here in the upper right hand corner, very different from the foxtails. This is a species that has very long membranous ligules, as I talked about earlier. Wild proso millet is another important weed in the state. You can see it has an open panicle up here. You can see it has hair characteristics that may be confusing with yellow foxtail, where you have these long hairs, but actually with wild proso millet you have these long hairs that come off the stem underneath the auricle region, if you will. Right underneath the leaf blade you'll see long hairs coming out everywhere. Here's quackgrass. I've already talked about quackgrass a little bit. Very compact panicle you'll see here. It is a perennial, very distinct seed shape especially in relationship to some of the other grass weeds I've already talked about, but it is a perennial weed with very long rhizomes underground, so it can spread and take over areas like this picture here. This is all quackgrass you're looking at here. So it can really spread and take over an area because of that. In contrast to another really important perennial spreading grass in the state of Wisconsin, which is wire stem muley. Wire stem muley spreads by branched stems, which also gives it a bushy appearance, if you will. So to look at that, here's a good example or a good picture of wire stem muley, and you'll see these branched stems, each of which can have multiple seed heads here. So unlike that very compact panicle that I showed you with quackgrass, here's an example of branching stems and wire stem muley spreading by branching stems versus underground rhizomes like the quackgrass spreads. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about important plant parts of broadleaf weeds. Now, in broadleaf weeds, we don't focus near as much on ligules. Obviously, ligules are one of the important characteristics, as well as hair configuration around the leaf blades for grasses. In broadleafs, we spend a lot more time talking about the leaf blade, the shape of the leaf blade, the way the leaf blade connects to the stem, and that sort of thing. So a couple important things I want to point out here is you have the type of leaf that we're going to talk about, or the leaf blade. You have the margin of that leaf blade, which is really important and quite distinctive. You also have a petiole here. So petiole is a new term that I'm going to talk about, and petiole is a term that describes this connecting miniature stem, if you will, but it connects the base of the leaf blade, which stops right here, to the stem. So here's the main stem part. And similar to grasses, we still have different types of inflorescence in broadleaf weeds. And so pointing out the inflorescence here, the seed head, if you will, which we talked about as being important in the grass weeds as well. Now, the leaf arrangement of these broadleafs are really critical and an important identification characteristic. You have a couple choices here. They can be alternate or opposite. If you look at this Canada thistle here on the left, this is an example of alternate leaf arrangement. So you'll see this leaf comes out of the stem and goes to the right, but there's not a leaf directly across the stem over here. You got to go up a little bit, then the leaf goes to the left, and then go up the stem. The next leaf will go to the right, go up the stem, the next leaf will go to the left. So it's alternate in that the leaves alternate which sides of the stem it's going to come off. In contrast to that, you have weeds like common ragweed that have opposite leaf arrangement, and so when you come up the stem, every place a leaf goes to the right, a leaf also goes to the left at the exact same location. Okay, so here's an example of opposite, where leaves are going left and right at the same location off the stem. Here's velvet leaf to the right. You'll see again another alternate arrangement. Now, I said petiole is important. Here's some examples. If we look at this Canada thistle, again here on the left, you'll see that this is a weed that has no petiole. The leaf blade comes all the way down and connects right to the stem. We call that sessile. Where these other weeds have petioles, some different variations of that. The velvet leaf here on the right, you'll see, has a very long petiole and tends to not have any axillary growth on this petiole, where here's an example of common ragweed, which also has a petiole, but oftentimes can have axillary growth coming out of the area where the petiole connects directly to the stem. Then we get into leaf shape. Now, leaf shape kind of talks about the overall shape. Well, I'm not talking specifically about the margin yet, but talks about the overall leaf shape. So here's Canada thistle again on the left. It has a very oblong leaf, where you have common ragweed in the middle, where it's cordate, where it's shows this kind of shape here, where it kind of goes out and then back in. So it goes out and then back in. Or here's another terminology called orbicular, where you see this leaf is mostly round, but still forms kind of a heart shape here at the end. So there are many other different types of leaf shapes that you can study, but certainly the overall shape of the leaf is important. And then you can get into the leaf margins, which are also very important. Here's just a couple example of again that common or that Canada thistle that shows a doubly serrated leaf shape, which just means it's going out and in and out and in up here. Here's a dissect leaf, this common ragweed, where it makes more of a lacy appearance. So you see this leaf is compound and is doing a lot of different things. Or in the case of velvet leaf, we call this undulate. It has small margins all the way around versus smooth. Other weeds may have a very smooth outer margin where there's no indentations as you go around the leaf at all. Root type is also important, and particularly important to understand on the perennial weed side. Again, I've already made mention of perennial root systems. You can have underground rhizomes. Here's Canada thistle on the left-hand side. You can see these underground structures. So this is going to be similar to quackgrass, where the root is going to grow underground, get away from one plant, and then it may sprout actually what appears from the above ground to be a completely separate plant, but they are actually connected below ground. And again, this gives perennial weeds the ability to really just take over an entire area. Over here on the right, obviously we have again a couple annual weeds, common ragweed and velvet leaf, same ones we've been looking at. You can just see here some simple taproot systems. Now you can also have simple taproots in perennial plants. So dandelion is a good example of a perennial plant that still has a simple taproot. It's just a very large taproot that has great storage mechanisms to survive winter. So you can still have taproots in perennial plant systems. The inflorescence structures of broadleafs can also be very unique across broadleafs and important to identify things. Here's just some examples. Canada thistle usually has a cluster of flower heads, and the size and shape of the flower head can be very critical in telling the differences between different thistles, like Canada thistle from bull thistle from musk thistle. This shape can be very unique across those. Here in the middle you can see common ragweed, where you see a whole raceme of flowers. This is the male parts of the flowers are easy to see. The female the female parts is where the seeds will be produced. They become more obvious when you actually go to collect the seeds, but they tend to be down near the base of these adjoining structures here. So you can have a whole raceme of flowers. You can also have compound flowers, but we call it solitary, where the seeds will be produced right near where the flowering mechanism is. Here's a seed pod, and every one of these pods here will have multiple seeds in it. So one of these capsules will have many different seeds in this. So the flowering structures and seed production structures are important. There are some just unique or special features for broadleaf identification in some of these weeds as well. One of those good examples is the smartweed family has a structure we call the ochrea, and it is an outer membrane that wraps around the stem and up and over top the beginning of the petiole. And you can see that kind of right here. I'm outlining it with this mouse. We call that an ochrea, and it's something that is just very characteristic and unique to the smartweed family. The rosette growth versus vertical growth is also really important to understand, particularly of biennials. So biennial plants oftentimes in that first year of growth will only grow as a rosette. So the rosette gets larger and larger as a collection mechanism to produce a larger and larger root system to survive winter, but it does not grow any vertical height until that second year, and that's a terminology we call bolting. So it rosettes the first year, and then in the second year it actually bolts and sends a stem growing more vertical before it actually flowers. So that often happens. It happens with some winter annuals, but is very characteristic of biennials. And then a lot of broadleaf, or some broadleaves, have what we call compound leaves. Here's an example of a compound leaf. From a crop standpoint, soybeans have a compound leaf. So in soybeans, you talk about leaves which have 3 leaflets to them. This is a good example here of yellow wood sorrel, actually, here on the right, where there are 3 leaflets, but all 3 of these make up one compound leaf. Talk a little bit more specific about Canada thistle. I've talked about this a couple times. It's a perennial. Flowers are purple to pink. You'll see those down here on the right, and you got these very characteristic leaves. In addition to the characteristics I've already talked about, hair is also still important sometimes to tell the difference between some of these broadleafs, particularly separating them out. So a good example of this actually is a thistle family where Canada thistle is hairless on both the top and bottom side of this leaf, where bull thistle, for instance, is very hairy on both the top side and bottom side of the leaf. So there's still ways to tell, or still importance on hair or lack of hair to tell apart some broadleaf weeds if they share other certain characteristics. Again, I already alluded this to earlier, but here's a good example of why the flower shape and flower characteristics can be very important to tell the difference. Here's Canada thistle on the left. I already said it has a whole cluster of flowers. You can see multiple cluster of flowers up here, where bull thistle in the center has a much larger flower appendage, but only has one flower. It's not a cluster of flowers. It only has one flower on every main stem as it comes up, instead of here you have a stem that comes up and 2 cluster of flowers at the very tip of it, but it's actually smaller. And here's an example of musk thistle, which has a very different shape to the flower altogether than both Canada and bull. So again, just some thoughts and differences there. Let's talk about probably one of our most important broadleaf weeds, or at least most common broadleaf weed in the state of Wisconsin. That's lamb's quarters. Lamb's quarters is in the Chenopodiaceae family. Simple but alternate or opposite leaves. So it can be weed with that has a lot of plasticity, has a grooved stem. It's usually greenish inconspicuous flowers. So not all plants or all weeds have colorful flowers. Sometimes they're just green inconspicuous flowers, or green flowers that you don't realize are actually flowering. Here's just a picture here. Again, you can see some of these leaves are alternate, and then you can actually have areas where they're opposite off the same leaf. These are summer annuals, very small seed, generally black, sometimes a purplish cast, but generally black seed there. Here's a better picture of a seedling picture, and then off to the right is a good example, or a good picture that shows the flowers, which can be very inconspicuous or greenish. So these structures here are actually the flowering structures, but they tend to be the same color as the plant. They don't have a showy red, pink, purple. It's just a very green, inconspicuous flowering structure. Here's just a better seedling picture of common ragweed. I've talked about a lot of specifics of common ragweed already, but here's just a seedling picture of common ragweed. This weed can be also one of our very important weeds in the state, particularly the eastern side of Wisconsin. Can be a very competitive broadleaf weed. It can easily reach 6.5 feet tall and be very competitive with both corn and soybean. Here's just some more pictures. They can also flower. Again, the flowers are fairly inconspicuous, and they can flower even though it can get 6.5 feet tall. It can start flowering much shorter if need be. Here's just a picture of this, of what the seed shape looks like in the upper left-hand corner, and a small seedling that show the spatula type cotyledons here. So here's the 2 cotyledons. Again, broadleaves we call dicots because it has 2 cotyledons. Here's a good example of that here in this lower left-hand corner. Here's just an up-close picture of male flowers here on the left as it goes up, and then the female flowers or the receptive flowers down near the base of the stem appendages here in the right-hand corner. Cousin to the common ragweed, or sister or cousin, however you want to say it, but would be giant ragweed. Very similar to common ragweed, but can be much larger in physical appearance, can be more competitive, and can be fast growing when they grow vertical. Giant ragweed can easily tower above corn plants. It can be 12, 13, 14 feet tall. You see the leaves tend to be compound, but they're not as lacy, if you will, in appearance as the common ragweed, where you generally have 3 main lobes of giant ragweed. You'll see me tracing here. It can actually even just have 1 large main lobe in some plants. And the seed has the same shape as what I just showed you with common ragweed, but the seed is much larger. Here's an up-close picture of common ragweed in corn, and you can see that it can keep a growth habit. It can grow at the same rate of corn very easily, and again be very, very competitive. Nightshade family can also be very important, particularly in processing crops. Nightshade is a good example of a crop that can not only be competitive and reduce yield, but can reduce quality. Nightshade produces berries, and those berries can stain, so can limit quality based on staining, particularly in soybean is a major concern of that. But they're also can be very problematic in a lot of vegetable crops because they are in the Solanaceae family, which is the same family as tomatoes and potatoes. And so many of the herbicides that control these weeds are not available in vegetable crops because of the similarities in families there. Eastern black nightshades often identified by the black side or very dark purple underside of the leaf. You can see the cotyledons here with kind of a triangular type shape that comes to the point, but this underside leaf is very characteristic. However, the seeds, even though the berries are black and stain purple, or the berries are purple and can stain purple and black, the seeds, if the berries are allowed to dry very naturally, the seeds are actually a very white or a very clear color once inside that berry. So here's an example of the purple black berries hanging down here, and again, these stain very badly. The Amaranthaceae family, or the pigweed family, is also a very important family in the state. It's a family that outcrosses very easily and has wide genetic diversity, as well as produces a lot of seed. There are many different pigweeds that are problematic in the state. Redroot pigweed, smooth pigweed are problematic. We have a lot of Powell amaranth. Water hemp is becoming much more important, and then spiny amaranth is also a difficult pigweed, particularly in pasture systems. We do now have a couple occurrences of Palmer amaranth, and I'll talk about that when we talk about resistance. Here's just some examples of some of the pigweed species here. Hair placement, leaf shape is again very important to tell the differences between pigweeds. All pigweeds tend to have very small, black, shiny seeds. So seeds are actually very difficult to tell apart among the pigweed families. Here's a picture of redroot pigweed. You see these long linear cotyledons. That's very characteristic of all the pigweeds as well. With some of the amaranths, they tend to be larger than some of the others, but basically same shape. As they get a little bit larger, again, very characteristic on the leaves here. Difficult to tell in this picture here, but redroot pigweed is very hairy. So again, that's a very important characteristic of telling the pigweed families apart. Redroot pigweed often does have a red root, but so do many of the other pigweeds. Very hairy stem. You can kind of pick it up in these pictures here, where Powell amaranth tends to have a more red stem most often. It tends to be less hairy, although it still has hairs on it. It tends to have a waxier appearance on the leaf. And then when you get to the inflorescence, redroot pigweed tends to have a more compact, thicker inflorescence, where the Powell amaranth tends to have shorter but more skinnier seed heads as they are branched up here in the inflorescence. So that's important as well. Another important family is a Malvasia family, which includes common mallow, Venice mallow, prickly sida, but the biggest one is velvet leaf. And velvet leaf is also a very problematic weed in the state. I've already talked about velvet leaf, so I don't want to spend too much time here. I've already showed you the leaf shape and the long petioles and the alternate arrangement of the leaf stem. So there's velvet leaf. One important characteristic is seed shape. We often say are kidney shaped, and that is very characteristic of the Malvasia family. So many of the seeds have the same kind of kidney sort of shape. Velvet leaf seed is much larger than the mallow seeds, but all of them tend to have the same shape. Here's just some pictures of velvet leaf. Again, velvet leaf can also get fairly large and be very, very competitive with our corn and soybean crops in the state of Wisconsin. Here's a good picture of velvet leaf being very competitive with corn on the left-hand side. Horseweed is an interesting weed and an important weed in the state. It's also an annual, but can be both a winter annual and summer annual. We often deal with this weed as a winter annual, so it forms a rosette. It germinates and emerges in the fall of the year, forms a rosette, survives the winter, and then it bolts the next spring. It produces many, many seeds. You can see the flowers, again, mostly green, but then have little white flowers out here on the end. And those flowering mechanisms, as they point out, actually later serve as what we call a pappus, which is an appendage to make the seeds airborne. So horseweed seed can fly very long distances in the air, can be wind transported, which is very problematic. It can actually travel further than dandelion. So if you've ever plucked a dandelion seed head and blown on it and watched the seeds fly away, horseweed can do the same thing. And also, the seeds are very small and surface germinate very well. So another connection between tillage systems and weed type, this is a good one right here, where horseweed tends to be very problematic in no-till situations because it's a weed that germinates from the surface and doesn't need any burial like some of the larger seeded broadleaves do. Here's just some more pictures. One of the rosette that emerges in the late summer and fall, and then up here in the left-hand corner is a picture of the seed with these appendages that actually make these seeds airborne. So we'll move in here. I said there's grasses, there's broadleaves, and then there's this third category called sedges. I already talked about this once. We like to say sedges have edges. There's always forms a triangle corm or stem. Here There are over 150 species in Wisconsin, but yellow nutsedge is the most common in crops. Yellow nutsedge tend to be more swampland type species, or sedges do, so if you do run across other species besides yellow, it's probably in some wetter areas of the state, or some areas that don't drain real well is where you'll run into some other types of sedges. But yellow is the most common. Here's just some pictures of yellow nutsedge. You can see it does flower here, but it also produces nutules underneath the ground as a long-term survival and reproduction mechanism. Here's a picture of those nutule tubers, if you will, up here in the upper right-hand corner. They can actually be fairly large, about the size of a peanut, or some of them can get about the size of a peanut. So I'm going to be done there. Again, I didn't describe in detail how to identify all of the different types of weeds in the state of Wisconsin. You'll have to study a little bit more of that on your own, but I tried to just point out a lot of different important things that we use in weed identification to help you do that as you study those different things. So at this point, I'm going to assume now that we've learned how to identify all the weeds, or you know how to identify all the weeds. And in the next segment, we're going to talk about why weeds are a problem in crops, and we're going to talk about weed crop competition, the types of resources they compete for, and that sort of thing.